Mouthwashing is a psychological indie horror game that was released in September of 2024. The game was developed by Wrong Organ and released by Critical Reflex. It is a first-person single-player game that follows the walking simulator style of interaction and exploration. The storyline is told in a non-linear fashion, making it stand out from other games as most follow a linear progression of storytelling. The game shows us that sometimes the worst monsters are those who are closest to us. Whether or not that may be connection-wise or within a close proximity, Mouthwashing truly showcases the saying that all actions have consequences. The story of Mouthwashing starts out on a space freighter named the Tulpar, a ship for the Pony Express. On the ship is a crew of 5, consisting of the Captain Curly, the co-pilot Jimmy, Anya the nurse, Swansea the mechanic, and Daisuke, an intern who is a last-minute addition to the crew. As they're 147 days into their estimated 382-day shipment duration, the Tulpar is sabotaged and crashes into an oncoming asteroid. Majority of the crew survives, but the Captain Curly has been critically injured and mutilated by the crash. Due to the crash, the majority of the ship is covered in a foam that blocks off the much-needed major resources of the ship. As the crew try to survive with limited resources they have, many different things come to light about how the crew's fate came to be. Cutting to 2 months after the crash, the crew is sitting around the table in the lounge, debating over checking what's in store in the cargo hold, in hopes that whatever they may find increases their rates of survival, as the ship is starting to run out of supplies and food. Facing the problem of being unable to access it without the captain, Jimmy takes this opportunity to promote himself to captain of the ship. Curly, who's being kept on painkillers, Anya asks Jimmy for his help as she's unable to stand the noises Curly makes trying to give him the medication. In a rush, Anya leaves medical as she can't bear to hear the sounds of Jimmy forcefully feeding Curly his medications. Learning that Swansea is guarding the ship's utility room, working on trying to cut down the solid wall of foam inside, due to the risks of reaching the foam, he's unwilling to let anyone in or help, even his intern Daisuke. In the cargo hold, the crew finds out it is filled to the brim with mouthwash. Shocked by the find, Anya states the sugar content renders it unusable for medical use. Swansea then takes a bottle, reading the fact it's 14% ethanol, he takes a drink, stating how he just broke 15 years of sobriety. Still greatly shocked by the find, Anya breaks down at the cargo hold. With the mouthwash being the main resource for survivability in the coming months, the crew can be seen becoming more and more drunk on the mouthwash in hopes of escaping the Tulpar. Jumping farther back to 7 days before the crash, in medical, Anya is finishing a psychiatric evaluation on the Captain Curly, and she says that she only has one more crew member to evaluate, Jimmy. Expressing her displeasure with him as he doesn't seem to take her seriously, Curly offers to do the evaluation for her. Finding Jimmy in front of utility, Curly and Jimmy go to the cockpit to do Jimmy's psychiatric evaluation. Learning that Jimmy seemed to have struggled back on Earth, he seems to have some sort of jealousy about Curly's success as the captain, as the two talk about their feelings in relation to their careers. But they're interrupted by the cockpit display saying message incoming as we see the printer printing the message from corporate. The day after, 6 days before the crash, Curly believes that he needs to break the news received the other day from corporate to the rest of the crew, despite the orders of keeping it confidential till they had almost reached their shipment location. Entering the lounge, Curly is surprised by the crew for his birthday, as there's one birthday celebration board trip. Seating themselves at the table around the birthday cake, they encourage Curly to make a speech. Instead, Curly breaks the news that the crew's being laid off, as the company is going out of business. Not taking this information lightly, especially Jimmy, he starts to poke at and belittle all his fellow crew members, including Curly saying he's headed for bigger and better, and he sarcastically suggests he eat some cake to celebrate. 3 months after the crash, Jimmy is awoken to the sounds of Curly wailing and moaning in pain. Daisuke is seen asleep on the floor, and Anya and Swansea are missing. Wondering if Curly had been given his meds, Jimmy goes to find Anya. Finding Anya and Swansea in the cockpit, the two are seen ending a serious conversation. Noticing Jimmy's presence, they stop and Anya covers her face, looking away from him. Asking Anya if she had given Curly his medication, saying she forgot, but as she tries to go to leave, Jimmy cuts her off, saying he'll do it himself. Back in medical, Jimmy takes note of how low they are on painkillers. Before going to feed Curly the medication, Jimmy shares his paranoia on how the crew looks at him and how Curly had thrown him in the driver's seat. As the scene fades to black, we hear the roughness of Jimmy force-feeding Curly as he wails out in pain. 4 months after the crash, as Jimmy, we are tasked to check on the crew. Daisuke is seen lying in the corridor, drunk on mouthwash. Talking to him, Daisuke reveals it was his mother who got him this internship, and that he hopes that she doesn't blame herself for the situation. In the lounge, Swansea is seen drunkenly dancing, and Anya is sitting at the table. Talking to Anya, she's startled by Jimmy's presence. He asks her if she was going to drink the mouthwash too, but Anya rejects the idea of doing so, saying that it wouldn't help the situation that she's in. She tells Jimmy that there's also still some medicine on board, but it's trapped in a storage locker in the hallway to medical that's covered by foam. After getting in an argument with a drunken Swansea to get the axe in order to access the hallway locker, we find the extra isopropyl alcohol and painkillers. Anya again asks Jimmy if he could feed Curly his painkillers, but this tips Jimmy over the edge, as he starts ranting about how he's the only one trying to actually fix things here, complying to everyone's demands because the captain has to take fucking responsibility on this goddamn ship. Anya apologizes, but Jimmy sends her off, telling her to make sure Daisuke doesn't choke on his own vomit, as he'll handle it, as he always does. Before feeding Curly his meds, Jimmy tells him that he misunderstood what pressure he was under before, telling him he will be a great captain again someday, and that he will both get them out of this mess. Jumping back to 2 days before the crash, Anya and Curly are seen talking in the lounge. The two discuss their sleeping troubles. Anya asks Curly how many days left of travel they have. Curly replying that there's around 237 days, which is around 8 months. Anya asks why the Pony Express put a lock on the door for medical and not the sleeping quarters. Curly suggests it's for the same reason there's one in the cockpit. Safety. 5 months after the crash, in the lounge, Daisuke comes running in yelling for help, stating that Anya is trapped inside medical. At the medical bay door, Jimmy becomes concerned with the stack of medical supplies trapped with her. Asking Anya if the door is stuck, she reveals that it's been intentionally locked from the inside. Anya states that this isn't her worst moment, stemming from her belief that our worst moments didn't define us or make people beyond repair, saying that she'll take care of it. Concerned that Curly is also trapped, Jimmy is desperate to find another way into medical. Daisuke suggests going through the off-limit broken vent from utility to medical. But as the two try to convince a drunken Swansea to let them into utility, Jimmy says there's no point with him and to leave him alone, pitching the idea that the most sane thing to do is to give him a spiked drink to knock him out, so the two of them can enter the room. Once Swansea is knocked out, Daisuke becomes hesitant, but Jimmy assures him that Curly and Anya are counting on him. Entering utility, the two discover it's barely phoned up like Swansea claimed it to be, and that one of the cryostasis pods is working. Jimmy convinces Daisuke that Swansea selfishly hid it for himself given the situation. Approaching the broken vent, Daisuke worries about how Swansea said it was unsafe, but Jimmy says Swansea would be proud of him, and that everyone is counting on him. Putting pressure on Daisuke, he enters the vent screaming from pain. Eventually reaching medical, he states, "Anya, what did you do?" 8 hours before judgment, Daisuke is seen bleeding out on Swansea's beddings. Jimmy reassures that he can fix this, but Swansea is not fazed by Jimmy's claims. Asking about the disinfectant from the extra medical stash, Jimmy lets him know that it was used as part of the cocktail and slowly tries to shift blame of Daisuke's injuries onto him, as he would have never have left them inside utility and that he had no choice but to drug him. Searching for disinfectant and finding a bottle of mouthwash, Jimmy pours it over Daisuke's wounds, despite Anya's claims of it being unusable for medical use. We then hear Daisuke's suppressed screams of pain. 6 hours before judgment, Daisuke is still bleeding out on the floor. Jimmy tells him to stay still, but Swansea calls out to Daisuke before he starts to raise the utility axe. Trying to get Swansea to stop, Swansea calls Daisuke a useless ray of goddamn sunshine and a damn good kid just trying his best, before mercy killing him right before the two's very eyes. Calling Swansea a monster, Jimmy tells Swansea that he knows about the cryostasis pod, but Swansea says he has no use for it. In medical, we find Anya slumped dead on the floor from overdosing on the ship's remaining painkillers. As Jimmy gets the gun from the drawer underneath Curly's cot, we can hear Curly break out a cry or laugh as Jimmy turns around to open the medical bay door, finding Swansea coming at him with the axe. Going back to one day before the crash, entering the cockpit, Curly finds a distressed Anya and asks her where she had put the gun. Anya states that she wouldn't hurt herself, but that she hid the case as she can't unlock it, and reveals to Curly that she's pregnant. Shocked, asking who the father is, Anya cuts him off, stating that she's told him before. Curly replies that he can fix it as he has known him for a long time, implying that the father is Jimmy. Anya states that if Curly wouldn't let her have the gun to protect herself, she hid it so then he, Jimmy, couldn't have it either. On crash day, in medical, we find Anya kneeling in front of the cot as she tells Curly that she told Jimmy about the pregnancy. Curly says she should have waited for him, but Anya, who is uncomfortable by Jimmy's presence on the ship, wants him removed. Curly says he can talk to him and that everything will be okay. Outside the cockpit, we find Jimmy. Curly assures he can fix the situation, but Jimmy wonders what may happen when they get back on Earth. Curly assures him again that they can figure it out, but Jimmy is unsatisfied and believes that none of their achievements will matter once the news breaks out, that both of them are on the line as Curly holds responsibility for the entirety of the crew. Bringing up an alternate ending, where the Tulpar crew is never found, Curly doesn't respond to his claim, but Jimmy says he'll take care of it, and walks into the cockpit. As the sounds of the ship's system fails, Curly walks toward the cockpit and finds Jimmy, begging that he didn't do what he thinks he did. And with no response, Curly walks into the cockpit himself as we hear the Tulpar crash. Back to the present 6 hours before judgment, with Jimmy finding the gun in medical, he proceeds to go after Swansea. As Jimmy holds the gun in front of Swansea, he tells Jimmy that he has something to say. Talking about his past as an alcoholic, he speaks about how he tried to turn his life around for himself and the family he made after turning sober. That nothing had ever felt so good when he was drunk, and that those were the best days of his life, and that he can see himself for what he is. Ready to die as he's able to see and accept his worst moments, unlike Jimmy, who is selfish and is too blind to see it. Regretting to be unable to protect Daisuke, Jimmy tells him that the both of them can make it, but Swansea tells him, "Fuck you," as Jimmy aims and pulls the trigger on him. Now, it's 0 hours before judgment. Curly is seen laid out on the table, surrounded by the crew members' corpses. Carrying Curly, the player is tasked to go home. Enter a utility, Jimmy places Curly in the lone cryostasis pod. Against the glass door, Jimmy tells Curly that everything will be okay, and that they fixed it. That he fixed it. Backing away from the pod's door, with Curly being unable to do anything, he watches in horror as his co-pilot, crew member, and friend pulls the trigger on himself, selfishly trying to paint himself as a tragic hero. As the cryopod turns on, the game's credit starts to roll. From the story, we learn that the ship and the crew's demise is all linked back to one person, Jimmy. The reasoning for him crashing the ship is most likely due to a multitude of things, the first being the fact the crew is being laid off, and the second being Anya's pregnancy. Jimmy, who apparently struggled back on Earth before Curly managed to get him a job with the Pony Express, being laid off was most definitely a big deal to him. Of course, this affected the rest of the crew too, but to Jimmy, it was something much greater. Previously showing his envy for Curly being at the top of the ladder during his psych eval, being laid off started to send Jimmy over the edge. And with the news that he had gotten Anya pregnant, concerned with the fact he may have to come deal with the consequences back on Earth for what he did, and what financial uncertainty is being brought upon him once they get back, he selfishly tries a failed murder-suicide with himself and the crew. Seeing that Jimmy tries to get rid of his problems the easy way out, causing losses for everyone else around him, showcasing his selfish nature. Throughout the game, the player is flashed with screens of black with white text to take responsibility. Ultimately, the one thing Jimmy is unable to do throughout the entire game, whether that's in regards to him crashing the ship, who he originally blames on Curly to the crew, or even blaming Swansea for Daisuke's death. Jimmy is incapable of taking responsibility for his actions, and refuses to face his consequences. Meanwhile, Curly does try to take responsibility, but it's of no use as the conflict between him and Jimmy being old friends. Curly is unable to make the harsher decisions of reprimanding Jimmy on the ship for his actions, still trying to see the good in him. But slowly he comes to realize that Jimmy is much crueler than what Anya was trying to tell him early on, believing that he knows Jimmy, believing that he couldn't be capable of anything too extreme. And as time passes on the ship and Jimmy's actions and behaviors become more erratic and violent towards others, especially Anya, Curly realizes that his choice to trust in Jimmy as he was an old-time friend was the worst mistake he had made. This can be seen when Jimmy gains access to the ship's gun. Curly is heard breaking out a cry or laugh, being unable to do anything in the given situation. He has no choice but to laugh at it all, at his foolishness and being blindsided. In truth, Curly did nothing to help ease Anya of her pain, barely recognizing how serious the situation was due to conflict with the person of interest, Jimmy. Even with Anya stating how there's locks on the medical bay door but not the crew's sleeping quarters, hinting at her sexual assault before she had formally told Curly she was pregnant, and when she does tell him that he knows who the father is, it implies she already approached Curly about being harassed sexually but also in general by Jimmy. By previously voicing her displeasure of interacting with him, she's often startled and uncomfortable when approached by Jimmy, and tends to avoid eye contact. And due to her trauma and pain of being raped by Jimmy, it is most likely the reason as to why she can't bring herself to feed Curly the painkillers. With the state Curly is in, being unable to consent to giving him the painkillers as he's completely helpless, it most likely reminds herself of the pain and trauma she went through during Jimmy's sexual assault. Hence why she asked Jimmy to feed him the painkillers, knowing he wouldn't think to ask and he would just use force if needed anyway, having his way with Curly like he did with Anya. Anya, still dealing with the news of being laid off and being trapped on the ship knowing Jimmy is capable of doing something to her again, seen through the fact Jimmy knows how to make a spiked cocktail that leaves one with no memory, Anya eventually takes her life because of it. Being unable to defend herself from her abuser, and the only person who could potentially get to him is incapacitated, Anya locking herself in medical in order to feel safe from her abuser, even in death, is incredibly devastating. In other ways, Curly lets Jimmy's actions slide, always telling Anya that he can take care of it, essentially shrugging off the situation. This lets Jimmy continue to not have respect for Anya at all as a coworker and essentially disregarding her as a person. Like when she originally locks herself in the medical bay, he's concerned that she's going to hurt Curly and not herself because he does not care what would happen to her whatsoever. This is also reflected with the fact Jimmy doesn't acknowledge her dead body in medical, but he's unable to bear the sight of Daisuke's blood all over the floor, showing how much he does not care for Anya at all. He only starts to care once Anya reveals she's pregnant, once she becomes a threat in his eyes. Fearing of how it would ruin his reputation and what may happen to himself and potentially to Curly, not truly caring for Anya's well-being at all because she's nothing compared to him, and only cares for the fact she's now standing in his way of success. Even in the end, as he's saying his goodbyes to Curly, Jimmy proclaims he saved everyone, that he fixed everything, when he was the one who led everyone to their demise, directly or indirectly, leading Anya to suicide due to how he took advantage of her, peer pressuring Daisuke to climb through the vents resulting in his extreme injuries and him being mercy killed by Swansea, and Jimmy shooting Swansea directly. With Jimmy selfishly ending his own life, leaving Curly all alone, it adds to him being unable to take responsibility and taking the option of the easy way out. And in the off chance Curly would be rescued and saved, the possibility of him being able to speak and communicate normally again would be a miracle, living up to Jamie's words of nobody being able to tell the tale. Mouthwashing tackles such a heavy and important topic of sexual assault in its game, while still keeping the players engaged with the psychological horror appeal of the game. Showing the events unfold through a non-linear storyline, we see every twist and turn in the character's story, showing how under pressure, the fragile human mind starts to crack and break. Seen through the isolated staging of the story, and the 5 crew members trapped on a ship in outer space, desperately trying to live, themselves as humans start to fall apart. The guilt of Jimmy's actions weighing on himself, mostly due to endangering his friend Curly, drives him to his breaking point. As he tries to defend himself, most likely from the guilt of hurting Curly, he quotes Anya about how our worst moments don't make us monsters, victimizing himself as his guilt consumed him, sacrificing himself for Curly to make himself believe that his one good deed won't let his worst moments define him.